did say we need to adopt the standard, but what was left out was what came afterwards. What Morris said is that we need to protect against bribery because we don't want anything like what happened with Louis XIV and Charles II. The example he gave of bribery was accepting actual money as the head of state. So what had happened in that example that Morris gave as his example of bribery was that Louis XIV, who was a bit of a recidivist when it came to bribes, gave Charles II a huge amount of money, as well as other benefits, including apparently a French mistress, in exchange for the secret treaty of Dover of 1670. It also was an exchange for his converting to Catholicism. But that wasn't some broad notion of bribery. It was actually quite narrow. So I don't think that dog will hunt in the 18th century, and I don't think it'll hunt today. Because if you take a look at the 21st century, bribery is well defined. And you shouldn't just take our word for it. You should look to how it's defined by the United States Supreme Court. In a case called McDonald versus the United States, the Supreme Court looked at a public corruption bribery case. This was a case where gifts were actually received, benefits were actually extended. There was completion. This was not some hypothetical of a crime that was not fulfilled or an action that was not actually taken. The Supreme Court unanimously overturned that conviction. Unanimously. And what they said was that you cannot take the bribery crime and use what they called a boundless interpretation. All the justices said that it's a dangerous thing to take a crime like bribery and apply a boundless interpretation. They rejected the notion, for example, that bribery could be used in terms of setting up meetings and other types of things that occur in the course of a public service career. So what I would caution the committee is that these crimes have meaning. It gives me no joy to disagree with my colleagues here. And I really don't have a dog in this fight. But you can't accuse a president of bribery. And then when some of us note that the Supreme Court has rejected your type of boundless interpretation, say, well, it's just impeachment. We really don't have to prove the elements. That's a favorite mantra, that is sort of close enough for jazz. Well, this isn't improvisational jazz. Close enough is not good enough. If you're going to accuse a president of bribery, you need to make it stick, because you're trying to remove a duly elected president of the United States. Now, it's unfair to accuse someone of a crime, and when others say, well, those interpretations you're using to define the crime are not valid, and to say they don't have to be valid, because this is impeachment. That has not been the standard historically. My testimony lays out the criminal allegations in the previous impeachments. Those were not just proven crimes, they were accepted crimes. That is, even the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee agreed that Bill Clinton had committed perjury. That's on the record, and a federal judge later said it was perjury. In the case of Nixon, the crimes were established. No one seriously disagreed with those crimes. Now, Johnson's the outlier because Johnson was a trapdoor crime. They basically created a crime knowing that Johnson wanted to replace Secretary of War Stanton. And Johnson did, because they had serious trouble in the cabinet. So they created a trapdoor crime, waited for him to fire the Secretary of War, and then they impeached him. But there's no question he committed the crime. It's just the underlying statute was unconstitutional. So I would caution you not only about bribery, but also obstruction. I'm sorry, Ranking Member, you?
No, you're doing a good job. Go ahead.
Okay. I'd also caution you about obstruction. Obstruction is a crime also with meaning. It has elements It has controlling case authority. The record does not establish obstruction in this case. That is, what my esteemed colleague said was certainly true. If you accept all of their presumptions, it would be obstruction. But impeachments have to be based on proof, not presumptions. That's the problem when you move towards impeachment on this abbreviated schedule that has not been explained to me. Why you want to set the record for the fastest impeachment. Fast is not good for impeachment. Narrow, fast impeachments have failed. Just ask Johnson. So the obstruction issue is an example of this problem. And here's my concern. The theory being put forward is that President Trump obstructed Congress by not turning over material requested by the committee. Okay? And citations have been made to the third article of the Nixon impeachment. Now, first of all, I want to confess, I've been a critic of the third article of the Nixon impeachment my whole life. My hair catches on fire every time someone mentions the third article. Why? Because you would be replicating one of the worst articles written on impeachment. Here's the reason why. Peter Rodino's position as chairman of Judiciary was that Congress alone decides what information may be given to it. Alone. His position was that the courts have no role in this. And so, by that theory, any refusal by a president based on executive privilege or immunities would be the basis of impeachment. That is essentially the theory that's being replicated today. President Trump has gone to Congress, to the courts. He's allowed to do that. We have 3 branches, not 2. I happen to agree with some of your criticism about President Trump, including that earlier quote where my colleagues talked about his saying that there's this Article 2, and he gives this overriding interpretation. I share that criticism. You're doing the same thing with Article 1. You're saying Article 1 gives us complete authority that when we demand information from another branch, it must be turned over or we'll impeach you in record time. Now, making that worse is that you have such a short investigation. It's a perfect storm. You set an incredibly short period, demand a huge amount of information, and when the president goes to court, you then impeach him. Now, does that track with what you've heard about impeachment? Does that track with the rule of law that we talked about? So, on obstruction, I would encourage you to think about this. In Nixon, it did go to the courts, and Nixon lost. And that was the reason Nixon resigned. He resigned a few days after the Supreme Court ruled against him in that critical case. But in that case, the court recognized there are executive privilege arguments that can be made. It didn't say, you had no right coming to us, don't darken our doorstep again. It said, we've heard your arguments, we've heard Congress's arguments, and you know what? You lose. Turn over the material to Congress. Do you know what that did for the judiciary is it gave this body legitimacy. It wasn't the Rodino extreme position that only you decide what information can be produced. Now, recently, there are some rulings against President Trump, including a ruling involving Don McGahn. Mr. Chairman, I testified in front of you a few months ago, and if you recall, we had an exchange, and I encouraged you to bring those actions. And I said I thought you would win, and you did. And I think it was an important win for this committee, because I don't agree with President Trump's argument in that case. But that's an example of what can happen if you actually subpoena witnesses and go to court. Then you have an obstruction case. Because a court issues an order, and unless they stay that order by a higher court, you have obstruction. But I can't emphasize this enough, and I'll say it just one more time. If you impeach a president, if you make a high crime and misdemeanor out of going to the courts, it is an abuse of power. It's your abuse of power. You are doing precisely what you're criticizing the president for doing. We have a third branch that deals with conflicts of the other two branches. And what comes out of there and what you do with it is the very definition of legitimacy.
Let's continue on. Let's unpack what you've been talking about. First of all, the McDonald case, how was that decided? Was that a very split court? Were they really torn about that? That case came out how?
Yeah, it came out unanimous. So did a couple of the other cases I cite in my testimony, which also refute these criminal theories.
One of the things that you said also, and I think could be summed up, and I use it sometimes, just what's the layman's language here, is facts don't matter. And that's what I heard a lot of in the 45 minutes. Well, the facts said this, or the facts are disputed this, but if this, if that, if this, it rises to an impeachment level. And that was sort of what you're saying, that crimes, I think your word was, crimes have meanings. And I think this is the concern that I have. Is there a concern that if we just say it up that facts don't matter, that we're also, as you've said, abusing our power as we go forward here and actually looking at what people would actually deem as an impeachable offense?
I think so. And part of the problem is that to bring a couple of these articles, you have to contradict the position of President Obama. President Obama withheld evidence from Congress in Fast and Furious, an investigation, a rather moronic program that led to the death of a federal agent. President Obama gave a sweeping argument that he was not only not going to give evidence to this body, but that a court had absolutely no role in determining whether he could withhold the evidence.
Mr. Earl, I have a question on that, because you brought up Mr. Obama, you brought up other presidents in this process. Is there not an obligation by the office of the president, we'll just use that term, not to be Obama, Trump, Clinton, anyway, isn't there an obligation by the president to actually assert the constitutional privileges or authorities that have been given or when accused of something, or crime or anything else?
Yeah, I think that President Obama has invoked too broadly. But on the other hand, he has actually released a lot of information. I've been friends with Bill Barr for a long time. We disagree on executive privilege. I'm a Madisonian scholar. I tend to favor Congress in disputes. And he is the inverse. His natural default is Article 2. My natural default is Article 1. But he actually has released more privileged information than any attorney general in my lifetime, including the Mueller report. These transcripts of these calls would be core executive privilege material. There's no question about that.
And I think that's something that's, again, not pointed out when you're doing a back and forth like we're doing. The transcript of the call release, the things that have been released from Mueller, as we go back through this, there has been, work in progress by this administration. I think the interesting point that I want to talk about is two things. Number one, Congress's abuse of its own power, which has not been discussed here, even internally, where we have had committees not willing to let members see transcripts, not being willing to give those up under the guise of impeachment, or you shouldn't be able to see them, although the rules of the House were never invoked to stop that. What we're seeing here, and I want to hit something else before we move on to something else, is the timing issue that you've talked about here. Again, I believe we talked about this with the Mueller report, we talked about this with everything else. This is one of the fastest, we're on track. I said this earlier, we're on a clock. The clock and the calendar are seemingly dominating this. Is irregardless of what anybody on this committee, and especially members not of this committee, to think about what we're actually seeing of fact witnesses and people moving forward. We don't have that yet. So the question becomes, is an election pending when facts are in dispute, and you may have mentioned this, this is one in which the facts are not unanimous. There's not universal, there's not even bipartisan agreement on the facts and what they lead to, especially when there's exculpatory evidence that has been presented, not in the Schiff report, but in other reports. Does that timing bother you from a historical perspective, not only in the past, but moving forward as well?
Yeah, fast and narrow is not a good recipe for impeachment. That's the case with Johnson. Narrow was the case with Clinton. They tend not to survive. They tend to collapse in front of the Senate. Impeachments are like buildings. There's a ratio between your foundation and your height. And this is the highest structure you can build under the Constitution. You want to build an impeachment? You have to have a foundation broad enough to support it. This is the narrowest impeachment in history. You could argue with Johnson. Johnson, it might actually be the fastest impeachment. Johnson actually actually was, what happened to Johnson was actually the fourth impeachment attempt against Johnson. And actually the record goes back a year before. They laid that trapdoor a year before. So it was not as fast as it made it out, it might appear.
And again, let's go back to, I want to go back to something else. And you talked about bribery, and Mr. Taylor's going to address a good bit of that, but I want to go back to something that you talked about, because it really bothers, I think, the perception out there of what's going on here in the disputed transcript, being that, the call has been laid out there. The president said, I wanted nothing for this. There's all this exculpatory evidence that was not presented in the last 45 minutes. But there is one thing that's interesting is, and it's been reported in the mainstream media, and it goes back to your issue of does crimes matter, or what this definition is that House, our majority initially accused the president, they kept saying quid pro quo, and we still hear it as we go through. But then, as reported, they used a political focus group to determine whether the phrase polled well. And apparently it didn't poll well, so they agreed to change their theory of the case to bribery. Does that not just feed into more of what you're saying about how we're actually, the crime matters and that facts do matter in a case like it, or at least should matter?
It does. There's a reason why every past impeachment has established crimes, and it's obvious. It's not that you can't impeach on a non-crime. You can. In fact, non-crimes have been part of past impeachments. It's just that they've never gone up alone or primarily as the basis of impeachment. That's the problem here. If you prove a quid pro quo, that you might have an impeachable offense. But to go up only on a non-criminal case would be the first time in history. So why is that the case? The reason is that crimes have an established definition and case law. So there's a concrete, independent body of law that assures the public that this is not just political, that this is a president who did something they could not do. You can't say the president is above the law if you then say the crimes you accuse him of really don't have to be established.
I think that's the problem right now that many members of this House, members of this body, and especially the American public are looking at, that if you say he's above the law, but then you don't define it or you define the facts to whatever you want to have, that is the ultimate railroad that everybody in this country should not be afforded. Everyone is afforded due process. Everyone is afforded the process to actually make their case heard. That's the concern that I have in this committee right now, and we've already seen it voted down that we're not going to look at certain fact witnesses. We're not even been promised other hearings in which this committee, and in the words and the concerns that echoed almost 20 years ago from the chairman, where he did not want to take the advice of another body or entity giving us, the Judiciary Committee, a report and then acting as a rubber stamp if we didn't do this. Just as a reminder, it was almost 2.5 weeks before the discussion of this kind of a hearing back then, before the hearing actually took place. These are the kind of things that, as timing goes, I think the obvious point here is that timing is becoming more of the issue because of the concern, as been stated before, about elections. They're more concerned about trying to fit the facts in to what the president supposedly did, presumably did, and make those hypotheticals stick to the American public. The problem is their timing, the definition of crimes, the definition of the fact that bribery as defined by the Supreme Court is not making their case. It's not fitting what they need to do. The issue that we have to deal with going forward is why the rush? Why do we still not have the information from the Intelligence Committee? Why is the Inspector General's report from the IC Committee being withheld, even in a classified setting? These are the problems that you have now highlighted.
Okay, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, is now recognized. Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Gramaglia, I'm looking at your presented statement, sir. Say you support confiscating guns from individuals determined to be a threat to themselves or others. Determined to be. So by this legislation my colleagues are putting forth, my understanding of the letter of that law, which I 1,000% oppose, as would our founding fathers, the letter of that law says an anonymous tip from a citizen. So if this was law, Commissioner, would you confiscate, would you go to your neighbor's home and confiscate his legally owned weapons, a man that was not under criminal investigation nor under arrest? Would you do it?
The red flag laws would...
That's a yes or no, brother. I got 5 minutes to make an hour-and-a-half statement here.
It's more than a yes or no answer.
We'll move on then. If you cannot say yes, you would confiscate weapons from an American citizen that was subject to this law that my colleagues intend to push through this Congress, then you said in your statement that you would confiscate those weapons if an American was determined to be, your quote, a threat to themselves or others. According to that law, determined to be is defined by an anonymous tip that an American citizen is a threat to themselves or others. You're a police commissioner, a thin blue line brother, sworn to uphold the Constitution, and you're saying you'd seize those weapons. I see that as a problem. I'm going to bring us back in time to World War II. America's population, 140 million. 15 million American men came home from World War II with deep scars and significant skills. They bore the invisible wounds of war. And there was weapons everywhere. We'll talk about mental challenge. My father was one of those men who was a Navy pilot in World War II. He came back from the war and built his family. I'm the seventh of his 8 children. I was born in 1961. We had guns everywhere. There was virtually no regulation. Any child in the 50s could buy a weapon from any seller if Daddy sent them with the money. We didn't have mass shootings. It wasn't until 1968 in America that serial numbers were even required on weapons sold in this country. You order weapons through the Sears catalog by the mail. In the 70s, I attended a high school, large rural school. Virtually every vehicle in the parking lot was a pickup truck, and almost every one had a rifle or a shotgun on the back glass and a pistol under the seat. And we didn't have school shootings. 1979, I began college. One of the jobs I had to work my way through college was as a carpenter. We restored historical buildings. We had to determine in the process of that work what was the original cuts of these homes, residential homes built 75, 85, 100 years ago. You could tell by the saw cut if it was a mechanical cut, an electric cut, or a hand cut. By such observations, we knew exactly how that house was originally built. And to my amazement as a young man, beginning college in Louisiana, working, to my amazement, you know what I discovered, Madam Chair? You know what these houses did not have that were built 100 years ago in cities in America? You know what they did not have, Commissioner? Locks. Locks. Now I ask you all, what happened to that country, man? A country where homes were built in cities with no locks. A country where guns were everywhere and virtually not regulated at all. Where millions of Americans, 14 million Americans came back. It's 11% of the population at the time after World War II with incredible skills of war and weapons of war, as you called them, everywhere. But we didn't have mass shootings. And here we sit today where an entire once proud Democratic Party is presenting unbelievably unconstitutional laws to press upon our nation, and we have a police commissioner that says he would go home to home and confiscate legally owned weapons if he got a tip. Madam Chair, I yield my speech, but I will not yield my opposition to these unconstitutional laws.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Phố đêm đèn mơ răng răng, màu trắng như vì sao gối đầu ngủ yên. Phố đêm nhiều lần suy tư, ghi nhớ còn trong đời những ngày thương tích lớn. Mây đen làm úa trắng gầy, cho nên tiếng say mềm trước thềm ngàn lời vu vơ, vì người hay mơ dòng đời như thơ. Nhớ ngày nào nắng ngủ trên cây, tường lá vàng úa tàn, mây bơ vơ bay khắp nẻo vô tình cho người yêu ước mơ. Người đi khai phá nét kiêu sa, tuy lính chiến xa nhà mà vẫn luôn yêu đời, bằng câu ca tiếng cười tìm vui trong giấc mơ, dù bâng khuâng chữ ngờ. Phố đêm lạc loài hương yêu, chìm đắm như hàng cây giá lạnh ướt mềm. Phố đêm chờ người phong sương, chinh chiến từ lâu rồi, có niềm riêng hay ước cho tôi 10 ngón thiên thần, cho tôi 10 ngón thiên thần, để rồi dìu người tôi yêu, dìu người không yêu và người chưa yêu. Vàng úa tàn, mây bơ vơ bay khắp nẻo vô tình cho người yêu ước mơ. Người đi khai phá nét kiêu sa, tuy lính chiến xa nhà mà vẫn luôn yêu đời, bằng câu ca tiếng cười tìm vui trong giấc mơ, dù bâng khuâng chữ ngờ. Phố đêm lạc loài hương yêu, chìm đắm như hàng cây giá lạnh ướt mềm. Phố đêm chờ người phong sương, chinh chiến từ lâu rồi, có niềm riêng hay ước cho tôi 10 ngón thiên thần, cho tôi 10 ngón thiên thần, để rồi dìu người tôi yêu, dìu người không yêu và người chưa yêu, để rồi dìu người tôi yêu, dìu người không yêu và người chưa